Every legend has a final chapter. Some heroes know when it begins. Some see it coming long before anyone else. But on a warm August morning in Memphis, Elvis Presley had no idea that the last 24 hours of his life had already begun. The world knew him as the king of rock and roll, the man whose voice transformed popular music forever, the performer who could silence an arena with a single note and bring thousands to their feet only seconds later. To millions of people, Elvis Presley wasn't simply a singer. He was an American icon, a cultural revolution, a symbol of freedom, a man whose influence reached far beyond the stage. But history remembers legends differently than ordinary people. When legends leave the world, time seems to pause. And on August 16, 1977, time would pause for millions. The night air over Memphis was warm and heavy. Humidity clung to the trees surrounding Graceland. The city was unusually quiet. Traffic had almost disappeared. Only the occasional sound of distant tires rolling across wet pavement broke the silence. Inside Graceland Mansion, everything appeared perfectly normal. Crystal chandeliers reflected softly across polished marble floors. Family portraits decorated the elegant hallways. Gold records shimmered beneath warm lights. Every room carried memories of an extraordinary career. Every photograph told another story. Every hallway reminded visitors that they were standing inside the home of the most famous entertainer in America. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. Nothing warned that history was only hours away. The old grandfather clock standing in the entrance hall continued its endless rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. No one paid attention to it. No one ever does, until later. Outside the famous iron gates, a small group of fans had already gathered. Some had driven hundreds of miles through the night.
One young couple carried an old vinyl copy of Love Me Tender. An elderly woman carefully held a faded black and white photograph taken years earlier outside one of Elvis's concerts. A teenage boy adjusted the lens of his camera, hoping he might finally catch a glimpse of the man whose music filled his bedroom every evening. They laughed together, shared stories, compared favorite songs. Some believed Elvis might leave the mansion later that day. Perhaps he would wave. Perhaps he would smile. Perhaps he would stop for just a moment. None of them imagined they were standing only a few steps away from one of the most heartbreaking moments in music history. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere remained calm. The kitchen slowly came to life. Coffee brewed. Plates were prepared. Soft conversations drifted through distant rooms before disappearing into silence. Staff members followed routines they had repeated countless times before. Nothing seemed different.
Routine has a strange way of hiding history. The greatest moments in life rarely arrive with dramatic music. They arrive disguised as ordinary mornings. Elvis Aaron Presley had lived beneath public attention for more than 2 decades. Every smile became a headline. Every performance became national news. Every photograph invited another story. Millions knew his face. Very few knew the man behind it. On stage, he looked fearless. His white eagle jumpsuit sparkled beneath brilliant lights. Crowds screamed his name before he sang a single word. The applause seemed endless. But when the curtains closed, another life began. One without cameras, one without reporters, one where silence often replaced applause. That was the life waiting inside Graceland. By the summer of 1977, Elvis remained one of the biggest stars in the world. His records continued selling. His concerts still attracted enormous audiences. Another tour had already been scheduled. The stage was waiting. The musicians were preparing. Fans across America had already begun counting the days until they could see him again. Hotels had been booked, tickets had been purchased, travel plans had been made. Nobody buying those tickets believed they would soon become souvenirs instead, because no one expected the king to disappear. Not yet. As dawn slowly approached, soft blue light spilled through Graceland's tall windows. The white columns outside caught the first colors of morning. Birds began singing somewhere beyond the gardens. The estate looked peaceful, almost timeless. It is difficult to believe that places connected to great tragedy once looked so ordinary, but they always do. History never announces itself. It whispers, quietly, patiently, waiting for the perfect moment. And inside Graceland, that moment was getting closer with every passing second. The grandfather clock continued swinging. Tick, tick, tick. The countdown had already begun, but no one inside the mansion could hear it. The mansion slowly awakened. A house as large as Graceland was never completely silent. Somewhere in the distance, a door quietly closed. A telephone rang for only a few moments before someone answered. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the hallways. Morning sunlight crept across the polished marble floor, turning the reflections of the crystal chandeliers into ribbons of gold. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt familiar. No one could have imagined that by the end of the day, these same hallways would be filled with hurried footsteps, worried voices, and flashing cameras. History often hides itself inside ordinary moments. It waits until everything is over before revealing how important those moments truly were. Elvis Presley had spent nearly his entire adult life surrounded by people. Managers, musicians, friends, employees, fans, reporters, photographers. Everywhere he went, someone was watching. Yet despite the constant attention, there were moments inside Graceland when the mansion became his refuge. Away from the screaming crowds, away from television cameras, away from the expectations that followed him everywhere. Behind the famous gates, he could briefly become something the public rarely allowed him to be. Simply Elvis. Not the king, not the superstar, not the headline. Just a man inside his own home. Outside the estate, the number of visitors slowly increased. Cars stopped along the road. Families stepped out carrying cameras. Children pointed toward the mansion with excitement. Some visitors had traveled from neighboring states. Others had crossed the country simply to stand outside the gates for a few minutes. No concert was taking place. No public appearance had been announced. Yet Graceland attracted people every single day. It had become more than a house. It had become a symbol. Every visitor hoped for the same thing. A wave, a smile, a brief glimpse of Elvis Presley. Sometimes that was enough to create a memory that lasted a lifetime. Inside the mansion, conversations turned toward the future. The upcoming concert tour was approaching quickly. Schedules had already been organized, travel routes had been planned, hotels had been reserved, equipment crews were preparing. Musicians expected rehearsals to begin soon. Everything suggested another successful tour. Everything suggested another chapter in one of the greatest careers in music history. No one in those rooms believed they were preparing for plans that would never happen. The pressure of fame had followed Elvis for more than 20 years. To millions of fans, he looked unstoppable. They saw the glittering jumpsuits, the powerful performances, the confident smile. But fame has a hidden cost. It demands attention every hour of every day. It turns private moments into public conversations. It transforms ordinary mistakes into national headlines. Very few people in history had experienced that level of attention. Elvis had lived with it almost every day since becoming a global phenomenon. And even after all those years, the world still expected him to be larger than life. Morning slowly became afternoon. The Tennessee sun climbed higher above Graceland. The gardens surrounding the mansion glowed beneath the bright summer light. Birds crossed the clear blue sky. The fountains shimmered quietly. Visitors outside the gates continued taking photographs, smiling without realizing they were capturing the final peaceful hours before history would change forever. Inside the estate, nothing appeared unusual. Staff members continued their daily routines. Friends came and went. Telephones rang. Coffee cups were replaced. Newspapers rested on polished wooden tables. Life continued exactly as it had so many times before. That is what makes history so unpredictable.
The moments that change the world rarely look extraordinary while they are happening. Only afterward do they become unforgettable. As afternoons slowly faded, long shadows stretched across the grounds of Graceland. The air became cooler. The golden light of the setting sun reflected from the mansion's white walls. It was beautiful, calm, almost cinematic. If someone had stood outside the gates that evening, they would have seen nothing more than another peaceful day at the home of America's greatest entertainer. They could never have known that the world they admired was only hours away from changing forever. Inside the mansion, the clock continued its quiet rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Each passing second carried Elvis Presley and everyone around him closer to a moment that would become part of music history. But no one noticed, because no one ever expects an ordinary day to become the day the world remembers forever. And as darkness slowly settled over Memphis, The longest night of Elvis Presley's life was about to begin. As evening settled over Memphis, the sky transformed into shades of orange, crimson, and deep blue. The summer heat slowly faded, replaced by a warm breeze that moved gently through the trees surrounding Graceland. Outside the famous gates, the final visitors of the day lingered for just a little longer. Some took one last photograph. Others quietly looked toward the mansion, hoping a curtain might move or a familiar figure might appear in a window. Eventually, one by one, they walked away. None of them knew they had just witnessed the final peaceful evening before history changed forever. Inside Graceland, the atmosphere remained remarkably calm. Soft music drifted through one of the rooms. The television played quietly in the background. Household staff continued their routines as they had done countless times before. There was no sense of panic, no feeling that anything extraordinary was about to happen. In fact, the greatest irony of that day was how completely ordinary it seemed. History rarely arrives with warning signs. It slips quietly into everyday life, and only later do people realize they were standing in the middle of it. For Elvis Presley, the future still appeared full of plans. Another tour was waiting, another audience, another standing ovation. Boxes of stage equipment had already been prepared. Musicians expected to see him again within days. Across America, thousands of fans looked forward to the next performance. Some had already packed their bags for the concerts. Some had framed their tickets. Others dreamed of hearing their favorite songs performed live for the very first time. None of them imagined those tickets would soon become keepsakes instead of memories. As darkness covered the estate, Graceland became quieter. Lights remained on in only a few rooms. The grand hallways that had echoed with conversations earlier now felt almost motionless. The marble floors reflected the soft glow of antique lamps. The grandfather clock continued marking every passing second. Tick, tick, tick. It had stood inside Graceland for years. Tonight it seemed louder than ever. Not because its rhythm had changed, but because history was listening. Outside, Memphis carried on as usual. Cars moved along Elvis Presley Boulevard.
Restaurants welcomed their last customers. Night shift workers began another ordinary evening. Radio stations continued playing music across the city. Some listeners smiled when an Elvis song came on. They sang along without realizing that, only hours later, those same songs would sound completely different. Inside the mansion, conversations became fewer. The day had been long. People slowly retired to their rooms. Doors closed softly. Hallway lights dimmed. Silence spread through Graceland. The house that had welcomed presidents, celebrities, musicians, and countless friends now rested beneath the quiet Tennessee night. Everything appeared peaceful. Everything appeared normal. Yet history often hides its most unforgettable moments behind perfect silence. For decades afterward, people would ask the same question. Were there signs? Did anyone know? The honest answer is simple: no. Those who were there later described the day as surprisingly ordinary. There was no dramatic farewell, no final speech, no unforgettable last performance. Life simply continued until it couldn't. And perhaps that is what makes the story so heartbreaking. The final chapter of one of the most famous lives in history did not begin beneath bright stage lights. It began inside a quiet home, on what everyone believed was just another day. Far beyond the gates of Graceland, the world slept peacefully. No newsroom was preparing a special edition.
No television network expected breaking news. No fan imagined they were only hours away from heartbreak. But destiny does not wait for anyone to be ready. It moves in silence. It keeps perfect time. And somewhere inside the mansion, the grandfather clock never stopped. Tick, tick, tick. The night grew deeper, the lights grew dimmer, and with every passing minute, the final hours of Elvis Presley's life drew closer. The morning that would shock the world was only a few hours away. The night settled over Memphis like a heavy curtain. Beyond the walls of Graceland, the city continued exactly as it always had. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Late-night diners served their final customers. Taxi drivers searched for one last fare before sunrise. Across America, millions of people climbed into bed without the slightest idea that history was only hours away from changing forever. Inside Graceland, time seemed to move differently. The mansion was quiet. The bright laughter that had echoed through its rooms earlier in the day had faded into silence. Only a handful of lights remained on. The polished marble floors reflected their warm glow, while the grandfather clock continued its endless rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Every second carried the world closer to a moment no one could stop. For years, Elvis Presley had lived a life unlike almost anyone else. His days rarely followed an ordinary schedule. While most of the world slept, Elvis often remained awake. Late nights had become part of his routine. Those closest to him understood it. There was nothing unusual about seeing lights on inside Graceland long after midnight. That evening was no different. The mansion remained calm. Members of the household moved quietly from room to room. Conversations came and went. The atmosphere was peaceful. No one sensed the tragedy that history would later remember. Plans for the future still filled the conversations inside the house. The upcoming tour remained the focus. Concert dates had already been announced. Equipment crews were preparing. Musicians expected rehearsals. Fans across the country eagerly counted the days until they could once again hear the unmistakable voice of Elvis Presley echo through an arena. The future still felt certain. No one imagined that every plan being discussed would soon become part of an unfinished story. Outside the gates, The final visitors slowly disappeared into the Memphis night. A young couple paused for one last photograph beneath the Graceland sign. An older fan rested his hand against the black iron fence for a brief moment before quietly walking away. He would later remember that evening for the rest of his life. Not because anything unusual had happened, but because it had been the last peaceful night. Inside the mansion, silence grew deeper. The televisions were switched off. Hallway lights became fewer. Doors closed softly. The enormous house seemed to exhale. Its elegant hallways, crystal chandeliers, and priceless memories now rested beneath the quiet Tennessee night. For decades, Graceland had witnessed celebrations, birthdays, family gatherings, career triumphs, and moments of private reflection. Tonight, it would quietly witness something else, something no one inside those walls expected. As the hours passed, the grandfather clock never missed a beat. Tick, tick, tick. It stood exactly where it always had, unmoved, unchanged, completely unaware that the life of the man who had filled these halls with music was approaching its final chapter. Outside, a light summer breeze stirred the trees surrounding the estate. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon. The city remained peaceful. Nothing suggested that before another afternoon arrived, newsrooms around the world would interrupt everything they were doing. History has a cruel habit. It often looks completely ordinary while it is happening. There are no warning sirens, no dramatic music, no invisible countdown that only a few people can hear. Only ordinary moments, stacked one upon another, until suddenly, they are no longer ordinary. Years later, the people who had been inside Graceland that night would replay every conversation in their minds, every smile, every handshake, every goodbye, searching for something they had missed, searching for a sign that had never revealed itself. Across America, Elvis Presley remained larger than life. His records continued to sell. His concerts continued to inspire. Young musicians dreamed of following in his footsteps. Children learned his songs from their parents. His influence stretched far beyond rock and roll. To millions, Elvis was not simply a performer. He represented an era, an unforgettable voice, a piece of American culture itself. No one imagined that by the end of the following day, radio stations would no longer be announcing another concert. They would be announcing the loss of a legend. The first hint of dawn slowly appeared beyond the trees surrounding Graceland. Dark blue skies gradually softened into pale gray. Birds began their morning songs. The city prepared to wake. Inside the mansion, the quiet night was coming to an end. A new day had arrived. But unlike every day before it, this one would be remembered forever. Within only a few hours, the peaceful silence of Graceland would be shattered. Emergency vehicles would race through its famous gates. The world would hold its breath, and millions would hear words they never believed they would hear. The longest night was over. The hardest morning was about to begin. The sun climbed higher over Memphis. It looked like every other August morning. Traffic moved through the city, stores opened their doors, children played outside, office workers poured their first cups of coffee. Across America, millions of people began another ordinary day. No one realized they were only moments away from hearing news that would become one of the most unforgettable announcements in music history. Inside Graceland, everything changed. Shortly before the afternoon, concern spread quickly through the mansion. Members of the household realized something was terribly wrong. The calm atmosphere that had filled the estate only hours earlier disappeared in an instant. Emergency services were called immediately. Within minutes, paramedics arrived at the famous mansion.
Their equipment echoed through the quiet hallways. Every second mattered. Every decision had to be made immediately. The peaceful silence that had defined Graceland for so many years was suddenly replaced by urgency. Outside the gates, a few visitors noticed unusual activity. They watched as emergency vehicles entered the property. No official information had been released. No one knew exactly what had happened. Questions began spreading almost immediately. People whispered to one another. Some hoped it was only a precaution. Others feared something far worse. Inside the mansion, medical personnel worked with complete focus. Every possible effort was made. Every available procedure was attempted. No one was thinking about history. No one was thinking about headlines. Everyone was thinking about one life. A short time later, Elvis Presley was transported to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. Doctors continued their attempts to revive him. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The room remained filled with determination, but despite every effort, the outcome never changed. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Aaron Presley was officially pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world itself had fallen silent. Inside newsrooms across America, telephones rang non-stop. Editors abandoned planned front pages. Television producers interrupted scheduled broadcasts. Radio stations paused their music. Then came the announcement that millions would remember for the rest of their lives. Elvis Presley has died. The reaction was immediate. Disbelief, shock, silence. Many listeners thought it had to be a mistake. Others simply refused to believe the words they had just heard. How could the man whose voice had defined an entire generation, the performer who seemed larger than life, be gone? Within hours, Graceland became the center of worldwide attention. Thousands of fans traveled to the mansion. Some carried flowers, others held photographs. Many brought worn vinyl records that had become treasured memories over the years. People stood quietly outside the famous gates. Some cried openly, some prayed. Others simply stared at the mansion in complete silence. No concert could have gathered so many hearts in one place. As evening arrived, candles began to appear outside Graceland. One by one, their small flames pushed back the darkness. Strangers embraced, stories were shared, favorite songs were quietly sung together. For many people, it felt as though they had lost a member of their own family. During the days that followed, newspapers around the world placed Elvis Presley on their front pages. Television networks replayed his greatest performances. Record stores were suddenly filled with people searching for his music. A new generation discovered his voice. An older generation remembered where they had been when they first heard his songs. At the same time, rumors began to spread. Some claimed Elvis had somehow survived. Others invented stories that grew larger with every passing year. Those rumors became books, magazine articles, and documentaries. Yet, despite their popularity, none has been supported by credible historical evidence. The documented record tells a different story. It tells the story of a gifted artist who transformed popular music forever. A performer whose influence crossed generations. A man whose success came with extraordinary pressure. Behind every standing ovation, there had been endless expectations. Behind every spotlight, there had been private moments the public rarely saw. And behind the legend, there had always been a human being. Today, nearly half a century later, Graceland remains one of the most visited homes in America. People from around the world still walk through its halls. They pause in the same rooms. They stand before the same gates. Not because they are searching for another mystery, but because they are remembering a remarkable life.
Very few artists change music.
Even fewer change culture. Elvis Presley changed both. His voice inspired generations of singers. His performances redefined live entertainment. His influence can still be heard in countless artists today. The final 24 hours of his life became one of the most remembered days in entertainment history. But they never defined who he was. His legacy was written long before that day. It was written in every song that brought people together, every performance that filled an arena, every dream he inspired. The stage lights eventually faded. The applause eventually ended. The curtains finally closed. But legends are never remembered for the moment they leave the stage. They are remembered for what they leave behind. Elvis Presley left behind more than music. He left behind hope, inspiration, a cultural revolution, and a voice that continues to echo across generations. Because as long as someone presses play on an Elvis Presley record, as long as someone sings along to one of his songs, and as long as the gates of Graceland continue to welcome visitors from around the world, the king of rock and roll will never truly be gone. His final day became history, his music became timeless, and his legend became forever.